Pay attention to what this hiker captured on their phone camera along the Serpent Valley River. See those three massive aircraft fuselages lying on the riverbank? At first glance, it looks like a train derailment, right? Just cargo that fell off the tracks. But look closer at the middle fuselage. Notice how one of the access panels is slightly ajar? The person filming had no idea what they were about to discover, because inside those aircraft bodies weren't spare parts or machinery. Inside were 25 people, some barely alive, some already gone, and what investigators would uncover next would expose the most twisted corporate conspiracy in American history. This is the story of the Rolling Tomb. You know that feeling when you're hiking through nature, trying to escape the chaos of everyday life, and suddenly you stumble onto something that changes everything? For outdoor photographer Jeremy Walsh, that moment came on a crisp autumn morning when he decided to take his camera to one of the most remote stretches of the Serpent Valley River in northern Idaho. Jeremy was the kind of guy who lived for these moments. 32 years old, worked as a freelance photographer for nature magazines, spent more time in the wilderness than in his small apartment in Boise. His Instagram was filled with breathtaking shots of mountains, rivers, wildlife. He'd been planning this trip for weeks, hoping to capture the morning mist rising off the river, maybe catch some elk grazing near the water. The hike to this particular spot wasn't easy. 3 miles of rough terrain, no marked trails, just following the river upstream through dense pine forests. But Jeremy knew the effort would be worth it. This section of the Serpent Valley was pristine, untouched, the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another human being. That morning, around 7:30, he heard it before he saw it. A sound that didn't belong in the wilderness. Metal scraping against metal. A low groaning noise that echoed through the canyon. Jeremy picked up his pace, pushing through the underbrush, and that's when he saw them. 3 massive turquoise-colored aircraft fuselages lying on the riverbank like beached whales. They'd clearly fallen from the railroad tracks that ran along the ridge above the river. The tracks serviced freight trains that moved cargo across the Pacific Northwest, and derailments, while rare, weren't unheard of in this mountainous terrain. Jeremy pulled out his phone and started filming. As a photographer, his instinct was always to document first, react later. He captured the scene, panning from one fuselage to the next, the river rushing past them, the morning light filtering through the pine trees. It looked surreal, almost apocalyptic. These giant metal tubes that should have been soaring through the sky were instead lying broken and abandoned in one of the most remote places in Idaho. But then Jeremy noticed something odd. One of the access panels on the middle fuselage was hanging open. Not damaged from the fall, but open. Like someone had unlatched it from the inside. And that's when he heard it. A sound that made his blood run cold. A weak, desperate knocking coming from inside the fuselage. Then a voice, barely audible, crying for help. Jeremy dropped his phone, still recording, and ran toward the aircraft body. What he was about to discover would turn a simple train derailment into something far more sinister. Let me paint you a picture of what was happening in the hours before Jeremy Walsh stumbled onto that riverbank, because while he was preparing for a peaceful morning photographing nature, 25 people were fighting for their lives inside those fuselages, knowing that train was careening toward disaster. But we need to go back further than that. We need to understand how those 25 people ended up in what federal investigators would later call a mobile prison. The story really begins 3 years earlier, in the spring of 2016, at a defense contracting company called Apex Aerospace Solutions, headquartered in Tucson, Arizona. Apex was one of those companies most Americans had never heard of, but they played a crucial role in national defense. They manufactured and supplied aircraft components to military contractors around the world. We're talking about parts that go into fighter jets, transport planes, helicopters, high-stakes stuff where quality control isn't just important, it's literally life or death. Apex employed about 800 people across 3 facilities in the Southwest. On paper, they looked like a legitimate, successful company. They had government contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Their CEO, Harrison Blackwell, was a retired Air Force colonel who'd built a reputation as a no-nonsense leader who always delivered on time and under budget. But here's what made it even more horrific. Behind that legitimate facade, Apex was running the most elaborate fraud scheme in aviation history. They were manufacturing substandard components, falsifying safety certifications, and selling defective parts that were being installed in military aircraft. We're talking about hydraulic systems that could fail mid-flight, avionics packages with counterfeit chips, structural components made with inferior materials that couldn't withstand the stress they were rated for. The scheme was brilliant in its simplicity. Apex would manufacture parts according to specifications, have them properly tested and certified, then swap them out with cheaper, substandard versions before shipping. The real parts would be sold on the black market to foreign buyers who didn't ask questions. The fake parts would be delivered to military contractors who trusted Apex's stellar reputation and rigorous quality control processes. It had been going on for nearly a decade. Tens of millions of dollars in profits. And nobody knew, until people started noticing things that didn't add up. The first person to spot something wrong was a quality assurance engineer named Elena Vasquez. She'd been with Apex for 6 years, worked in their Phoenix facility, was known for her meticulous attention to detail. In July 2016, Elena was reviewing test results for a batch of hydraulic actuators destined for F-18 fighter jets when she noticed something odd. The metal composition in the lab reports didn't match the specifications in the original requisition documents. At first, she thought it was just a clerical error. But Elena was thorough. She pulled test results from previous batches and found similar discrepancies going back months. Different alloys, different stress tolerances, components that looked right on paper but weren't what they were supposed to be. Elena did what you'd expect an honest employee to do. She reported her findings to her supervisor, Marcus Chen, a senior quality control manager who'd been with Apex for nearly 15 years. She figured Marcus would want to get to the bottom of it, fix whatever systemic error was causing these discrepancies. Instead, Marcus told her not to worry about it, said the lab had recently updated their testing protocols, and the new reports looked different, but meant the same thing. It was a brush-off, and Elena knew it. So she kept digging, late nights in the office, comparing documents, cross-referencing shipping manifests with production records. And the more she looked, the more wrong she found. Components that were supposed to be made from titanium alloys were actually made from standard steel. Parts that should have undergone stress testing showed certificates, but had never actually been tested. It was systemic, deliberate, massive in scale. Elena made copies of everything she found. Digital files on a thumb drive, physical copies hidden in her apartment. And then she made a decision that would change her life forever. She contacted the Inspector General's office at the Department of Defense to report the fraud. That was August 14th, 2016. 10 days later, Elena Vasquez disappeared. Her sister Carmen was the first to notice something was wrong. Elena was supposed to meet her for dinner on August 4th. Never showed up. Didn't answer her phone. Carmen drove to Elena's apartment and found her car in the parking lot. Her apartment locked. Everything inside exactly as Elena would have left it for work that morning. Coffee cup in the sink, bed made, nothing disturbed. But Elena was gone. Carmen reported her missing immediately. Phoenix police treated it as a standard missing person case. 29-year-old woman, no history of mental health issues, no financial problems, no relationship troubles, no obvious reason to disappear. They investigated, interviewed co-workers and friends, checked her bank records and phone records. The last ping from her cell phone was near the Apex facility around 6 p.m. the evening she vanished. After that, nothing. The investigation went cold within weeks. Phoenix PD had no leads, no evidence of foul play, no body. Elena Vasquez became just another missing person statistic, another face on a flyer, another family left without answers. But Elena wasn't the only one, because the thing about a conspiracy this big is that it requires a lot of people looking the other way, and some people just can't do that. 3 months after Elena disappeared, a warehouse supervisor named Dwight Patterson started noticing irregularities in the shipping department at Apex's Tucson facility. Components that were logged as shipped to military contractors were actually being diverted to different addresses. Shell companies with generic names like Pacific Logistics Solutions and Western Distribution Group. Dwight had been in logistics for 20 years. He knew what legitimate shipping looked like, and this wasn't it. Dwight made the same mistake Elena did. He reported his concerns to his supervisor. 2 weeks later, on November 19, 2016, Dwight Patterson didn't show up for his shift. His wife, Gloria, called the police when he didn't come home that night. His truck was found in the Apex parking lot. Dwight was gone. Then there was Natalie Thornton, a senior accountant who noticed payments to consulting firms that didn't seem to do any actual consulting. She started asking questions, disappeared in February 2017, and Robert Kim, a compliance officer who discovered falsified FAA certificates, gone in April 2017, and Melissa Strand, an investigative journalist for an aviation trade publication who was working on a story about safety violations in military aircraft, vanished in June 2017. One by one, people who got too close to the truth just disappeared. Different cities, different circumstances, but always the same pattern. They discovered something wrong at Apex. They reported it or investigated it, and then they were gone. But here's the thing about missing persons cases. Unless there's clear evidence of a crime, they're often treated as isolated incidents. Elena Vasquez's disappearance in Phoenix didn't get connected to Dwight Patterson's disappearance in Tucson. Different jurisdictions, different investigators, no apparent connection. The missing persons were spread across Arizona, Nevada, California, Oregon, and Washington. No one was seeing the pattern because no one was looking at it from high enough to see what was really happening. The person who saw the pattern was an FBI agent named Rachel Cordova. She was assigned to the Phoenix field office, and in early 2017, she was working on a completely different case involving defense contract fraud when Elena Vasquez's name came up. Rachel pulled the missing person file and something about it bothered her. Quality assurance engineer at a defense contractor disappears right after discovering irregularities. No trace. It felt wrong. Rachel started looking into Apex Aerospace Solutions, and that's when she found the others. 8 people with connections to Apex, all missing within a 9-month period. When she expanded her search to include anyone in the aviation industry who'd gone missing in the Southwest, the number jumped to 15. Rachel tried to get a task force organized, tried to get resources to investigate Apex properly, but she was fighting an uphill battle. Missing persons cases are local jurisdiction. The FBI gets involved when there's clear evidence of kidnapping across state lines or connection to organized crime. Rachel had a pattern that made her suspicious, but no hard evidence. No bodies, no witnesses, no proof that any of these disappearances were connected to each other, let alone to Apex. So she kept working it on her own time, building her case, waiting for the break she needed. While Rachel was investigating on the outside, something even more twisted was happening on the inside. Because those missing people weren't dead, not all of them anyway. They were being held prisoner in the most unusual and terrifying way imaginable. Harrison Blackwell, Apex's CEO, hadn't gotten where he was by being sloppy. When Elena de Vasquez contacted the Inspector General, Blackwell's head of security, Dennis Kruger, intercepted the communication. Kruger was ex-military, had connections in intelligence circles, knew how to make problems disappear. But Blackwell and Kruger had a different idea. They realized that killing whistleblowers created bodies, and bodies created investigations. Missing persons cases, on the other hand, often went cold. So they developed a system. Anyone who discovered the fraud would be abducted and imprisoned, not in a warehouse or a basement, but in decommissioned aircraft fuselages that Apex was supposed to be scrapping. Think about the genius of it for a second. Apex regularly received old aircraft bodies that needed to be dismantled for parts. These fuselages would sit in their facilities for weeks or months before being processed. Kruger had them modified, turning sections of them into prison cells with reinforced doors, ventilation systems, even basic plumbing. The prisoners would be kept sedated most of the time, given just enough food and water to survive. But here's what made it even more diabolical. These fuselages weren't stationary. Kruger arranged to have them transported by rail between Apex facilities and various storage yards across the western United States. The prisoners were literally moving from state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, making any investigation nearly impossible. The fuselages would show up on shipping manifests as aircraft components for processing, and no one questioned it because that's what Apex did. Elena Vasquez was the first prisoner. She was grabbed in the Apex parking lot, drugged, and woke up inside a modified section of a Boeing 737 fuselage. By the time the fuselage was shipped out 3 days later, Elena was locked in what essentially became a mobile coffin, moving up and down the West Coast on freight trains. Over the next 2.5 years, 24 more people joined her. Not all in the same fuselage, but spread across 3 different aircraft bodies that were constantly being moved. Some prisoners were there for months, some for over a year. The conditions were horrific. Minimal food and water, kept drugged to keep them compliant and quiet, barely enough room to move. Several prisoners didn't survive. According to records investigators would later find, 17 people died in captivity from medical neglect, malnutrition, or simply giving up hope. The survivors, who would later testify, said it was like being buried alive, but worse. Because you could hear the train moving, feel the motion, know that you were traveling through the world, but completely cut off from it. Some prisoners could hear each other through the thin walls, whispering in the darkness, trying to maintain their sanity. Among the prisoners were people like Curtis Hammond, a senior test pilot who'd noticed that planes he was testing were handling differently than their specs suggested, and Yolanda Martinez, an FAA inspector who was investigating complaints about Apex's safety protocols, and Brian Cho, a software engineer who'd designed quality control systems for Apex and realized the data was being manipulated. Each one of them had discovered a piece of the fraud. Each one had been silenced, and the conspiracy kept running, moving millions of dollars of defective components into military aircraft, putting pilots' lives at risk, all while the evidence of their crimes literally rolled past investigators on rail lines across the country. But on the night of October 8, 2019, everything changed. The freight train designated as Northwest Cargo 7743 left Apex's Spokane, Washington storage facility at 11:47 p.m., heading southeast toward Idaho. The manifest listed it as carrying aircraft components and industrial machinery. What it actually carried were 3 modified fuselages containing 25 prisoners, some who'd been in captivity for over 3 years. The route took the train along the Serpent Valley line, a mountainous stretch of track that followed the river through some of the most remote territory in the Pacific Northwest. It was a route the train had taken dozens of times before, but that night, a combination of factors came together in the worst possible way. The train was overweight. The fuselages, with their modifications and the added weight of supplies and the prisoners themselves, exceeded safe load limits. The engineer, Michael Torres, didn't know this because the shipping manifests had been falsified. He thought he was hauling standard cargo. The track maintenance in that section was behind schedule. There was a hairpin curve at mile marker 47, right where the tracks ran along a ridge above the Serpent Valley River, and the rails there had been flagged for inspection but not yet repaired. A small stress fracture in the track bed. At 4:23 a.m., as the train rounded that curve at 43 miles per hour, the fracture gave way. The rails spread. The rear 8 cars derailed, including the 3 flatbed cars carrying the fuselages. Michael Torres felt the train jerk and immediately hit the emergency brake. The locomotive and the front 12 cars came to a grinding halt, but the rear section, already derailed, had too much momentum. The flatbed cars tipped, spilling their cargo down the embankment toward the river. The fuselages tumbled end over end, crashing through pine trees, slamming into rocks. The noise was tremendous, a screaming crash of metal on stone that echoed through the canyon. And then, silence. The 3 aircraft bodies came to rest on the riverbank, battered and broken, but mostly intact. Inside, the prisoners who were still alive were battered, bruised, some with broken bones from being thrown around during the crash. But they were alive, and for the first time in months or years, some of them had a chance at freedom. Because the crash had damaged the reinforced doors and panels that had been keeping them locked inside, Curtis Hammond, who'd been imprisoned for 11 months, managed to get one of the access panels partially open. He started banging on it, trying to make noise, hoping someone would hear. But they were in the middle of nowhere. The nearest road was miles away. The train crew was dealing with the derailment up on the tracks and hadn't yet realized what their cargo actually contained. The prisoners inside those fuselages spent the next 3 hours in darkness, not knowing if anyone would ever find them, not knowing if this was their chance at rescue or just a different way to die. And then Jeremy Walsh came hiking along the river with his camera. The 911 call came in at 7:52 a.m. on October 9, 2019. The dispatcher in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, initially thought it was a prank, a hiker claiming he'd found people trapped inside airplane parts on a riverbank. It sounded insane. But Jeremy Walsh wasn't joking. He was frantic, out of breath from running, trying to explain what he'd found. The dispatcher could hear the desperation in his voice. Within minutes, she'd contacted the Kootenai County Sheriff's Department and had every available unit heading toward the Serpent Valley River. Sheriff's Deputy Amanda Reeves was the first to arrive, reaching Jeremy's location about 40 minutes after the call. Jeremy met her on the access road, still shaking, and led her down to the riverbank. Amanda radioed for backup the moment she saw the scene. 3 massive aircraft fuselages, clearly derailed from the tracks above, and sounds, unmistakable sounds, coming from inside them, voices calling for help. The next few hours were chaos. More deputies arrived, followed by fire and rescue crews from 3 different counties. They had to use cutting equipment to pry open the access panels fully, and what they found inside was beyond anything they could have imagined. The first person they pulled out was Curtis Hammond. He was emaciated, disoriented, his legs so weak from months of inactivity that he couldn't stand. He kept saying over and over, "There are more. There are more inside." Paramedics wrapped him in blankets, started an IV, trying to stabilize him while rescue workers cut deeper into the fuselage. Then came Yolanda Martinez, then Brian Cho, then more and more. Some could walk with assistance. Some had to be carried out on stretchers. All of them were in various states of malnutrition and dehydration. Several had infections from untreated injuries. 2 were unconscious and unresponsive. But not everyone they found was alive. In the rear section of one fuselage, rescue workers discovered 3 bodies. Later, in another section, 4 more. People who died in captivity, their bodies never removed, adding to the horror of what the survivors had endured. By noon, all 25 prisoners had been removed from the fuselages. 18 were alive, 7 were dead. The survivors were transported to hospitals in Coeur d'Alene and Spokane. The scene on the riverbank was immediately secured as a crime scene, and the FBI was called in. Sheriff Tom Brennan held a press conference that evening. He could barely get through it. This was a rural county that maybe saw 1 or 2 homicides a year. Now they had 7 dead bodies and 18 victims of what was clearly a massive kidnapping operation. The national media picked up the story within hours. By the next morning, Serpent Valley was the lead story on every news channel in the country. FBI agent Rachel Cordova saw the news and immediately knew this was connected to the case she'd been building against Apex Aerospace. She was on a plane to Idaho that night, landing in Spokane at 2 a.m., driving straight to the hospital where the survivors were being treated. Elena Vasquez was the first person Rachel spoke with. Elena had been imprisoned for 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. She was 32 years old but looked 50. Her hair had gone partially gray. She'd lost almost 40 pounds, but her mind was sharp, and she remembered everything. "I knew someone would find us eventually," Elena told Rachel from her hospital bed. "I just didn't know if I'd still be alive when they did." Elena told Rachel everything. How she'd discovered the fraud at Apex, how she'd reported it to the inspector general, how two men grabbed her in the parking lot, drugged her, and she woke up inside the fuselage, how she'd spent over 3 years moving from state to state, never knowing where she was, listening to other prisoners arrive and sometimes die. The other survivors had similar stories. Each one had discovered something about Apex's fraud scheme. Each one had been silenced, and all of them could identify their captors, starting with Dennis Kruger, Apex's head of security. Rachel coordinated with the FBI's Phoenix field office, and within 24 hours, had warrants to raid Apex aerospace facilities in Tucson, Phoenix, and Spokane. The raids happened simultaneously at 6 a.m. on October 11, 2019. Hundreds of federal agents swarming 3 locations at once. What they found was damning. In Harrison Blackwell's office, agents discovered detailed records of the fraud scheme going back 12 years. We're talking about spreadsheets tracking which components were swapped, which certifications were falsified, how much money each fraudulent shipment generated. Blackwell had kept everything meticulously documented, probably never imagining it would be found. But even more disturbing were the files Dennis Kruger kept. He had detailed records of every prisoner, names, dates of abduction, locations where they were being held, notes on their physical condition. He'd treated it like a logistics operation, tracking his prisoners the way a warehouse tracks inventory. The files revealed 17 additional victims who died in captivity, including their names and where their bodies had been disposed of. The body recovery operation began immediately. Using Kruger's records, FBI and local law enforcement teams fanned out across Arizona, Nevada, and California, searching remote desert locations where bodies had been buried. Over the next 3 weeks, they recovered 15 of the 17 bodies. The other 2 were never found. Meanwhile, federal prosecutors were building what would become one of the largest criminal cases in American history. The charges would eventually include kidnapping, murder, fraud, conspiracy, and a dozen other counts. They had survivor testimony, documentary evidence, physical evidence from the fuselages, and Kruger's own meticulous records documenting his crimes. But first, they had to catch the people responsible, because by the time the FBI raided Apex facilities, several key conspirators had already fled. Harrison Blackwell was arrested at his home in Paradise Valley, Arizona, on the morning of October 11th. FBI agents found him packing a suitcase, 2 fake passports on his bed, and a briefcase containing $400,000 in cash and bearer bonds. He'd been planning to run, but hadn't moved fast enough. Dennis Kruger was harder to find. He'd disappeared the same day the derailment happened, the moment news broke about prisoners being found. Rachel Cordova suspected Kruger had informants who tipped him off the second the 911 call came in. He'd gone underground, and tracking him became the FBI's top priority. But here's the thing about people like Kruger. They're good at planning, good at logistics, good at staying hidden, but they also have patterns and connections they can't quite break. Rachel spent 2 weeks analyzing Kruger's known associates, his financial records, his military background. She was looking for where he might run and who might help him. The break came from an unexpected source. One of the other Apex executives who'd been arrested, a vice president of operations named Roger Finch, agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Finch told investigators that Kruger had a contingency plan. If the operation was ever exposed, Kruger was supposed to get to Mexico City, where contacts would help him disappear into Central or South America. The FBI coordinated with Mexican authorities and flagged border crossings. On October 23, 2019, Dennis Kruger was spotted trying to cross into Mexico at Nogales, Arizona, using a fake passport. Border agents stopped his vehicle, and Kruger tried to run. He didn't get far. He was arrested at gunpoint and immediately extradited back to Phoenix. With Blackwell and Kruger in custody, the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. Investigators discovered that at least 14 other Apex employees had been directly involved in either the fraud scheme or the kidnapping operation. Some knew everything, some only knew pieces, but all of them had played roles in one of the most disturbing criminal conspiracies in modern American history, The fraud itself had generated over $340 million in illegal profits over 12 years. Defective components manufactured by Apex had been installed in over 1,200 military aircraft. By pure luck, there had been no catastrophic failures that resulted in crashes or deaths, but investigators found multiple incidents where equipment malfunctions could have been traced back to Apex components if anyone had been looking. And then there was the human toll. 25 people kidnapped, 17 murdered, families destroyed, lives ruined, all to protect a fraud scheme and the profits it generated. But the case was about to get even more complicated, because as federal prosecutors prepared their charges against Harrison Blackwell, Dennis Kruger, and the other conspirators, they faced a unique challenge. How do you prosecute a case this massive, with this many victims, this many crimes, without it becoming a circus? The lead prosecutor was a U.S. attorney named Margaret Chen, and she decided early on that they needed to keep the focus on the victims. Every decision, every strategy was built around giving the survivors and the families of the dead a sense of justice. Margaret worked closely with Rachel Cordova and the FBI to build an airtight case. They interviewed each survivor multiple times, documenting every detail of their ordeal. They brought in experts to analyze the modifications made to the fuselages, turning them into prisons. They traced the financial records showing how Apex had funded the kidnapping operation. They prepared visual presentations showing the travel routes of the trains, documenting how the prisoners had been moved across state lines dozens of times. And critically, Margaret made sure the medical examiners thoroughly documented the condition of every body they recovered. The families of the 17 murdered victims deserved answers, deserved to know what had happened to their loved ones. While the prosecutors built their case, the survivors were facing their own challenges. Being rescued doesn't mean being healed. These were people who'd been held captive for months or years, living in darkness, uncertain if they'd ever be free. The psychological trauma was immense. Elena Vasquez spent 3 months in physical therapy just to regain her strength. She had nightmares every night, waking up in a panic, convinced she was still trapped inside the fuselage. Her sister Carmen moved in with her, helping her navigate a world that felt alien and overwhelming after years of captivity. Curtis Hammond struggled with survivor's guilt. He'd heard other prisoners dying, heard their last breaths through the thin walls, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he should have done more to help them. Therapy helped, but the weight of what he'd experienced would never fully lift. Yolanda Martinez focused on anger. She was furious at Apex, at Kruger, at a system that had let this conspiracy operate for so long. Her fury drove her to become the most vocal of the survivors, doing media interviews, working with prosecutors, making sure everyone understood the full horror of what had been done. But through all the trauma and pain, the survivors shared one thing. They wanted Harrison Blackwell and Dennis Kruger to face justice. They wanted their day in court, wanted to look their captors in the eye and make them answer for what they'd done. That day would come, but not as quickly as anyone hoped, because defense attorneys for. Blackwell and Kruger immediately started filing motions, challenging evidence, seeking delays. They knew their clients had no real defense, so their strategy was to drag out the process, hoping that time would work in their favor. It didn't work. Margaret Chen and her team were relentless, countering every motion, pushing the case forward. And behind the scenes, Rachel Cordova and the FBI were still investigating, because they knew that a conspiracy this large couldn't have operated without outside help. That investigation led them to corrupt officials who'd helped Apex win government contracts despite safety violations. It led them to a network of shell companies used to launder the fraud proceeds, and it led them to foreign buyers who'd purchased the defective components, knowing they were substandard but not caring as long as the price was right. By the spring of 2020, federal prosecutors had indicted 32 people in connection with the Apex conspiracy. Not all of them would face trial. Some pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate. Some fled the country and were still fugitives. But the core conspirators, the ones who'd orchestrated and carried out the kidnappings and murders, were all in custody. And the evidence against them was overwhelming. survivor testimony, documentary evidence, physical evidence from the modified fuselages, financial records showing payments for the operation, digital evidence including emails and text messages discussing the problem of whistleblowers. Harrison Blackwell's defense team tried to argue that he'd had no knowledge of the kidnappings, that Dennis Kruger had acted independently, but prosecutors had emails from Blackwell explicitly approving Kruger's solution to the whistleblower problem. They had financial records showing Blackwell had personally authorized payments for the fuselage modifications. He was involved at every level. Dennis Kruger's attorneys tried a different approach. They argued he was following orders, that Blackwell was ultimately responsible, but Kruger had been the architect of the entire kidnapping operation. He designed the mobile prisons, arranged the transportation, maintained the records. He was the hands-on operator who'd made the nightmare real. Neither defense strategy was going to work, and both legal teams knew it. But they had to try something. Their clients were facing multiple counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges. A conviction meant life in prison without possibility of parole. As the trial date approached, tension in the survivors' community was high. These were people who'd been through unimaginable trauma. Now they'd have to relive it in a courtroom, testify in front of their captors, describe in detail the horror they'd endured. Margaret Chen prepared them as best she could, working with victim advocates and therapists to help the survivors get ready. But there's no way to fully prepare someone for that experience. You just have to trust that they're strong enough to see it through. And these survivors were strong. They'd survived something that would have broken most people. They'd held on to hope when hope seemed impossible. They'd supported each other through years of darkness. And now they were ready to face the people who'd done this to them. The trial was set to begin on September 14, 2020, in federal court in Phoenix. It would be one of the most closely watched trials in American history. But before the trial could start, something happened that nobody expected. Remember those two victims whose bodies were never recovered? One of them was a man named Arthur Simmons, a quality control inspector who disappeared in March 2018. According to Kruger's records, Arthur had been held in one of the fuselages for 7 months before dying of complications from diabetes that went untreated in captivity. His body was supposedly buried in a remote location in Nevada, but search teams never found it. Arthur's widow, Linda Simmons, had been living in a state of limbo for 2.5 years. She knew her husband was dead, knew what had happened to him, but without a body, she couldn't fully grieve, couldn't get closure. In late August 2020, 3 weeks before the trial was supposed to start, Linda was contacted by the FBI. A hiker in Nevada had discovered human remains that matched Arthur's description. DNA testing confirmed it was him, but what the FBI found with Arthur's body would crack the case even wider open. Buried with him was a briefcase, and inside that briefcase were documents that Arthur had managed to hide on his person when he was abducted. Documents that proved Apex's fraud scheme went even deeper than anyone had realized. The documents showed that Apex had been selling defective components not just to American military contractors, but to foreign governments, including several countries with hostile relationships with the United States. They'd been compromising American aircraft while simultaneously putting American adversaries at risk with the same defective parts. The national security implications were staggering. Margaret Chen immediately filed amended charges. The conspiracy now included violations of the Arms Export Control Act, espionage-related offenses, and charges related to undermining national security. Harrison Blackwell and Dennis Kruger weren't just kidnappers and murderers. They were traitors who'd endangered national security for profit. The trial had to be delayed while prosecutors incorporated the new evidence. The defense teams tried to get the documents excluded, arguing they'd been improperly obtained. But the judge ruled that documents found with a victim's body were admissible evidence. Arthur Simmons, even in death, had delivered one final blow to the people who'd killed him. The trial finally began on November 2nd, 2020. The courthouse in Phoenix was surrounded by media from around the world. Inside, the courtroom was packed with survivors, families of victims, journalists, and observers. Harrison Blackwell and Dennis Kruger sat at the defense table, both looking far different than they had when they were running Apex. Blackwell had lost weight, his expensive suits no longer fitting right. Kruger looked older, harder, his military bearing giving way to the face of a man who knew he was finished. The prosecution's case took 6 weeks to present. Survivor after survivor took the stand, describing their ordeals. Medical examiners testified about the victims who died. FBI agents walked the jury through the evidence. Financial experts explained the fraud scheme. National security officials testified about the implications of Apex's actions. The most powerful testimony came from Elena Vasquez. She spent 3 days on the stand, methodically describing everything from discovering the fraud to being kidnapped to 3 years of captivity. She looked directly at Dennis Kruger when she described hearing other prisoners die. She looked at Harrison Blackwell when she described the despair of thinking she'd never be free. The defense put on a brief case, trying to create reasonable doubt, trying to shift blame, trying anything that might work. It didn't. The evidence was too strong, the testimony too powerful, the truth too obvious. After 8 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury on December 23, 2020. They deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, they returned with their verdict. Guilty on all counts for both Harrison Blackwell and Dennis Kruger. The courtroom erupted when the verdict was read. Survivors hugged each other, crying. Families of the victims who died wept with relief. It was justice, finally, after years of horror and pain. But that wasn't the end, because while Blackwell and Kruger's trial was the biggest, there were still 30 other defendants to deal with. Over the next year, federal prosecutors worked through the remaining cases. Some defendants pleaded guilty and received reduced sentences in exchange for testimony. Some went to trial and were convicted. A few were acquitted when evidence showed they'd had limited knowledge of the full scope of the conspiracy. Roger Finch, the vice president who'd cooperated and helped catch Kruger, received a sentence of 15 years in prison despite his cooperation. His information had been valuable, but he'd still been deeply involved in the fraud scheme. Marcus Chen, Elena Vasquez's former supervisor who'd brushed off her concerns, was convicted of conspiracy and obstruction of justice and received 12 years. But the focus remained on the two main architects of the nightmare. Harrison Blackwell's sentencing hearing was held in February 2021. The proceeding lasted 2 full days as survivor after survivor read victim impact statements. Elena Vasquez spoke again, as did Curtis Hammond, Yolanda Martinez, and 15 other survivors. Family members of the 17 murdered victims spoke about the loved ones they'd lost. Harrison Blackwell showed no remorse. He sat stone-faced through all of it, occasionally whispering to his attorneys but never acknowledging the pain his actions had caused. When given a chance to speak before sentencing, he declined. The judge, Federal District Judge Patricia Morrison, delivered a scathing rebuke before pronouncing sentence. She described Blackwell's crimes as among the most depraved and calculated acts of cruelty this court has ever encountered. She noted that he'd not only orchestrated the kidnapping and murder of innocent people, but had done so purely to protect his profits and reputation. Judge Morrison sentenced Harrison Blackwell to 17 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, plus an additional 240 years for the fraud and national security violations. He would die in prison. There was no other possibility. Dennis Kruger's sentencing came a week later. Unlike Blackwell, Kruger did speak before sentencing. He gave a bizarre, rambling statement where he tried to justify his actions as necessary to protect Apex's business and employees. He claimed he'd treated the prisoners humanely, given the circumstances. He showed no real remorse, no understanding of the gravity of his crimes. Judge Morrison was even harsher with Kruger. "You were the hands that carried out these atrocities," she told him. "You designed the prisons, you maintained them, you watched people die and did nothing. You are, in the truest sense, a monster." She sentenced Dennis Kruger to 17 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus 300 additional years. She wanted to ensure that even if some technicality ever resulted in one conviction being overturned, Kruger would still never see freedom. But remember that video Jeremy Walsh captured on his phone that morning when he first saw the fuselages on the riverbank? That footage became crucial in the trial in a way nobody initially expected. The defense had tried to argue that the prisoners' accounts of their captivity were exaggerated, that conditions inside the fuselages weren't as bad as survivors claimed. They suggested, outrageously, that some prisoners might have even been there voluntarily as part of some kind of bizarre arrangement. But Jeremy's video, taken within hours of the derailment, showed the scene exactly as it was. When forensic specialists analyzed the footage, they could see details that Jeremy hadn't even noticed while filming. You could see the reinforced access panels, clearly modified beyond normal aircraft specifications. You could see the ventilation systems that had been added. Most importantly, when Jeremy got close to the middle fuselage, his phone's microphone picked up sounds from inside, banging, voices calling for help, sounds of people in distress. That video was played in court, showing the jury the exact moment when the nightmare these survivors had described came to light. It was powerful evidence that corroborated everything the survivors had testified about. The defense's attempts to minimize the horror were destroyed by footage captured by a hiker who just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Jeremy Walsh testified briefly during the trial, explaining how he'd come to be on that riverbank that morning. He'd become something of a reluctant hero in the media, the photographer who'd stumbled onto one of the biggest criminal cases in American history. But Jeremy never sought attention. He'd done what anyone would have done, he said. He'd heard people in trouble and tried to help. The video also proved crucial in another way. Defense attorneys for several of the lower-level defendants had tried to argue their clients couldn't have known what was really happening, that the modified fuselages looked normal from the outside. But Jeremy's footage showed they clearly didn't. The modifications were obvious to anyone who looked. That video helped prosecutors secure convictions against Apex employees who'd claimed ignorance. After the main trials concluded, the civil cases began. The survivors and families of victims filed lawsuits against Apex Aerospace Solutions, its executives, and several other companies that had been involved in the conspiracy. Apex had already declared bankruptcy, but its insurance policies and remaining assets were substantial. In March 2022, a settlement was reached. The victims would receive a total of $840 million, distributed based on the length of their captivity, or, for families of the deceased, the circumstances of their loved one's death. No amount of money could make up for what they'd been through, but it at least provided financial security and resources for ongoing medical and psychological care. The survivors used their platform to push for changes in how defense contractors are monitored and how missing persons cases are investigated. Elena Vasquez became a leading advocate for better coordination between law enforcement agencies when dealing with missing persons. She pointed out that if someone had been tracking disappearances connected to Apex earlier, lives could have been saved. Rachel Cordova, the FBI agent who'd been investigating the case before the derailment broke it wide open, testified before Congress about the need for better systems to identify patterns in missing persons cases. Her work led to new protocols for information sharing between federal and local agencies. The families of the 17 murdered victims established a foundation in their loved ones' names, focused on supporting families of missing persons and funding cold case investigations. They'd lived through years of not knowing what had happened to their family members. They wanted to help others avoid that agony. But the impact went beyond just the immediate victims and their families. The Apex case led to a complete overhaul of oversight for defense contractors. Congress passed the Military Aviation Safety Act in 2021, requiring independent verification of all components going into military aircraft and establishing whistleblower protections for anyone reporting safety violations or fraud. The FAA implemented new tracking systems for aircraft parts, making it much harder for the kind of fraud Apex had perpetrated to go undetected. and the Department of Defense conducted a massive review of all aircraft that had received Apex components, resulting in the replacement of thousands of parts and the grounding of several aircraft until safety could be verified. As for the survivors themselves, they each found their own path forward. Some, like Elena Vasquez and Yolanda Martinez, became advocates and public figures. Others chose privacy, wanting to rebuild their lives away from the spotlight. Curtis Hammond went back to flying, though he never worked with military aircraft again. He became a flight instructor, teaching others to love aviation the way he once had, before Apex had tried to take that away from him. Brian Cho, the software engineer, started a company focused on developing transparent quality control systems for manufacturing. His goal was to create tools that would make fraud like Apex's impossible to hide. Several survivors wrote books about their experiences. Others gave occasional interviews, but mostly lived quiet lives. They'd survived something unimaginable. How they chose to live afterward was entirely up to them. The physical site of the derailment on the Serpent Valley River became an unofficial memorial. The Forest Service decided to leave a small section of one fuselage on the riverbank as a reminder. Visitors who hike the trail that Jeremy Walsh was on that morning can see it, along with a plaque listing the names of all 42 victims, the 25 who were imprisoned, the 17 who died before being found, and others who suffered because of Apex's actions. Jeremy Walsh still hikes in the area, still takes photographs of the wilderness he loves, but he never goes near that particular section of the river. Some memories are too heavy to revisit. The case continues to resonate. True crime documentaries have been made about it. Investigative reporters continue to uncover new details about how the conspiracy operated and how it went undetected for so long. The story has become a cautionary tale about corporate greed, about what happens when profit is valued over human life, about how systems designed to protect us can fail when people choose to look the other way. But more than anything, it's a story about survival, about people who endured unimaginable horror and came out the other side, about their strength, their courage, their refusal to be broken. Elena Vasquez, in an interview 3 years after the rescue, was asked how she'd managed to survive 3 years of captivity without losing hope. Her answer was simple but profound. "I survived because I had to," she said, "because I knew someone was looking for me. My sister never stopped searching. Agent Cordova never stopped investigating. And I knew that if I gave up, then Blackwell and Kruger would win. I couldn't let them win." That refusal to let evil win, that determination to survive and seek justice, that's what defines this case. Not the horror of what was done, but the strength of those who endured it and fought back. The Apex Aerospace conspiracy stands as one of the most disturbing corporate crimes in American history. The derailment on the Serpent Valley River on October 9, 2019, wasn't just a transportation accident. It was the moment when a carefully constructed nightmare collapsed, exposing crimes that had been hidden in plain sight for years. Today, 18 survivors continue to rebuild their lives, carrying scars both visible and invisible from their ordeal. The families of the 17 who didn't survive have found some measure of peace in knowing their loved ones' stories have been told and their killers held accountable. Harrison Blackwell is serving his 17 consecutive life sentences at ADX Florence, the Supermax federal prison in Colorado. He'll never be released. Dennis Kruger is at the same facility, in a different cell block. They'll both die in prison, paying for the rest of their lives for what they did. The others involved in the conspiracy are scattered across the federal prison system, serving sentences ranging from 8 years to multiple life terms. Some may eventually be released. Others will die behind bars. Harrison Blackwell was convicted of 17 counts of first-degree murder, 25 counts of kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, fraud, violations of the Arms Export Control Act, conspiracy to undermine national security, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 17 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole plus 240 years. Dennis Kruger was convicted of 17 counts of first-degree murder, 25 counts of kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 17 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole plus 300 years. 30 other defendants were convicted on various charges including conspiracy, fraud, kidnapping, accessory to murder, obstruction of justice, and violations of federal safety regulations, with sentences ranging from 8 years to life in prison. The case changed how America monitors defense contractors, investigates missing persons, and protects whistleblowers. New laws and regulations were written in the blood and suffering of the apex victims. But the legacy of Serpent Valley is more than just policy changes and prison sentences. It's a reminder of human resilience. Elena Vasquez spent 3 years in darkness and came out fighting. Curtis Hammond endured months of captivity and went back to the skies. Yolanda Martinez channeled her trauma into advocacy that's helping others. They survived. They testified. They rebuilt. And in doing so, they transformed their nightmare into something that might prevent others from suffering the same fate. In memory of Elena Vasquez, Dwight Patterson, Natalie Thornton, Robert Kim, Melissa Strand, Arthur Simmons, and all 42 victims whose lives were shattered by the Apex conspiracy. Your courage, your testimony, and your refusal to be forgotten changed the world. May the 17 who didn't survive rest in peace, knowing that justice was served, and may the survivors find peace in whatever form that takes for them. Some horrors can't be undone, but they can be answered. And in the story of Serpent Valley, they were.